these attacks show that Putin is just mocking any kind of peace efforts that are made. So what we have to do is increase pressure on Russia, and this is really what they understand, the pressure.
That was Kaja Kallas, basically the foreign minister for the European Union yesterday, referring to a Russian strike in Kyiv overnight that caused significant damage. A lot of, actually the most damage, death in terms of casualties of any Russian strike in the war, with 18 that were killed and a bunch of others that were wounded. We showed you some of that footage yesterday. Gary's showing it to you right now. But the reaction out of Ukraine and the response out of Russia shows that these two sides are moving in opposite directions. We are not moving closer to peace. We are moving closer to, well, I don't know if it's closer to, but we're continuing down the road of war. And I think the conclusion is basically that the peace process is over, if we're just going to be honest. I know everybody would like it to go in that direction to get the war over with. Most assuredly, me and our guest today, our favorite, Alexander Mercouris. We hadn't had you on in a while, so I've been missing you, man. Good to have you back on, co-host of the Duran YouTube channel. Good to see you back on us today.
Well, as I said, I've been away because it's been August, but it's absolutely great to be back, and to be particularly great to be back on this show and to discuss these rather disturbing things, obviously, but no better person to speak about and discuss them with than you on this program.
Well, thanks, and of course we do have to be unintimidated and uncompromised and true, and that's one of the hallmarks of both your show and ours, and why we're so grateful to have you on today. This strike, just to kind of bring everybody up in case somebody is not aware of what happened, on the 28th, Russia fired its second largest barrage of the war throughout Ukraine and hit quite a number of targets in many places. The biggest headliner came from Kyiv for obvious reasons, that's the capital, but also because of the damage that was hit. And there was what all the video evidence looks like, and what we can see image-wise, it just looks like a big apartment building that got hit. There was a bunch of kids that got hurt, some that got killed. And you know, it made a lot of people furious. And in fact, in addition to that, and this is one of the first things I want to talk to you about here, is that Russia chose to strike this target. Of course, they certainly have a lot of intelligence about what they're striking and where. And even if they claim that there is some military hardware in there, and by the way, we'll just point out, we don't actually know. We can't make any independent assessment of whether there was or wasn't. We'll get to that in a minute. But there has been experiences in the past where Ukraine did put military facilities or personnel and other things inside of civilian infrastructure. They have done that, so there is precedent for that. There's also precedent that just outright civilian targets have been hit as well by the Russians, whether intentional or unintentional or missiles falling, who can say. But this is part of the horrible things of war, that there are civilians that are paying the price for this. As a result of that, though, this missile was chosen. It's a double tap, and this was by missiles. This wasn't drones. These were missiles, which means it's the high priority targets for Russia. They chose to go after something that was right next to embassy facilities of both the UK and the European Union. And in fact, the ambassadors were summoned from the UK. Both the UK and EU summoned their Russian ambassadors, and according to this article here, the United Kingdom and European Union summoned their respective Russian ambassadors after the Kremlin military pounded Kyiv with a massive drone and missile strike overnight, killing 18 people and damaging both the EU mission building and the British consul offices in Ukraine's capital. Now, that obviously has the diplomats and the Europeans very upset. That would certainly have been predictable. Do you think that this was just an incidental strike, or do you think that it was chosen right next to these diplomatic offices on purpose?
No, I don't think it was chosen because those diplomatic offices were there and that there was some attempt to try and intimidate the Europeans or the British. I mean, I don't see the logic of doing that. And the one thing I would say about the way in which the Russians have conducted this war is that they've been extremely calculated when they strike at targets. So I think that the Russians were definitely striking something that was important, at least that they judged to be important. Of course, we can't second guess because we don't know what their intelligence is, and we don't. They're not going to share their intelligence with us, and the Ukrainians, understandably, are not telling us. But I strongly suspect that there was some important facility, and quite possibly, and this happens, and we shouldn't be critical of this either. Quite possibly, the Ukrainians located this facility, whatever it was, closer to these missions because they thought that that would provide it with some degree of protection. And by the way, there has been real shock in Europe, in Britain, about this, not just about this particular attack, but about the whole Kyiv attack altogether. I don't know what the Russians were heading for, what they were doing in Kyiv. We don't really know. But there's something about this particular strike that does seem to have caused a lot of alarm and dismay in European capitals. I mean, clearly something was happening there. It may be the industrial facilities that we were attacked, or maybe there was intelligence operations or something going on. But it does look as if there was some shock and surprise as well. Now, to be very clear, if the Russians attacked a civilian apartment building, even if they knew that there was some kind of intelligence or other thing happening inside that building, well, I think that we are in potential war crimes territory. And I think that is something we do need to say. You probably know an awful lot more about this than I do, but you always have to make judgments. There has to be proportionality. If the Ukrainians are concealing something that is in a civilian building, then you need to be very, very, very careful before you attack that civilian building. And if you do this recklessly or disproportionately, then we are looking at a possible war crime, and there ought to be investigations. At least that's my own understanding of the law. I think you're more familiar with this area than I am, obviously, but that's my own sense. And I would be worried if the Russians recklessly and heedlessly did that, even if the Ukrainians were concealing something there. The Ukrainians do have a history of placing their military facilities in civilian areas. Amnesty International did a report about this way years ago and complained about it. And when I say, investigations and war crimes, it might also affect the Ukrainians too. So, there are concerns, but I don't think the Russians were deliberately seeking to kill civilians. And I don't think they were deliberately aiming to damage diplomatic premises. But clearly, there were things there that they wanted to destroy. I don't know exactly what happened. I hope they did it in a responsible way. It does seem tragically that people were killed. One would like to believe that there would be an impartial investigation of this. Of course, there won't be.
But of course there won't. Well, we do know what the European Union thinks about this. They actually released a statement by, I think, 25 of the 26. I think everybody but Hungary signed on to it. And they are not confused about what they think of it was. They say, quote, intentional attacks against civilians and non-military objects are war crimes. All commanders, perpetrators, accomplices of these grave violations of international humanitarian law shall be held to account. These crimes only reinforce our determination and resolve to support Ukraine and its people in their defense against Russia and their pursuit of a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. And then in response to that, they say maybe we can now do another round, a 19th round of package of sanctions. So what this shows is there's certainly not going to be any independent examination of this, of course, because in a war, truth is usually the first casualty. And we've certainly seen lots of truth casualties on all rounds and all sides of this war so far. So it's really hard to ascertain intentions, motives, what may or may not have happened, what the intent was. I don't know about that, but what we can see very clearly is the result is it is a hardening of positions of the two sides. And so we see Ukraine and European Union, and not as much the U.S., but to some extent, he's more like static at the moment. But we see a movement away from any kind of consultations about making a concession if further away from that. As a matter of fact, let me reinforce that a little bit. Here's what Zelensky said after the strikes.
Цей удар абсолютно чітко демонструє, що російські цілі дійсно не змінилися. Вони хочуть воювати, б'ють не тільки по наших людях, не тільки по наших містах, наших громадах. Росія зараз завдає ударів по всім у світі, хто прагне миру. Це удар по Україні, це удар по Європі. Також це удар Росії по президенту Трампу, по інших глобальних суб'єктах. У Вашингтоні ми чули, що Путін начебто готовий до закінчення війни, до зустрічі на рівні лідерів та вирішення ключових питань. Але він обирає балістику замість будь-яких реальних кроків до миру. Він вбиває дітей, щоб не говорити про те, коли і як буде мир. Проблема в тому, що він не боїться ось так бити по тим лідерам, яким він щось обіцяє. Це не тільки президент Америки. Це так само стосується країн, які ще досі торгують з Путіним, такі як Китай чи Індія, інші країни Азії, Латинська Америка. Росія просто втягує їх в свої спільники такими ударами, такими вбивством людей.
So I don't know if some people may have had a hard time reading some of those small words at the bottom, transcribing that into English. But basically what he's saying, hey, this is a strike against the world. It's against the Ukraine. It's against Europe. It's against the United States. And then, it puts a highlight on all of the accomplices, China, India, anybody else who's buying Russian oil and gas, etc., which also includes European countries. He didn't mention that. No. But he's trying to just exploit this for the maximum value that he can get it in the direction of moving away, because he'll accuse Russia of not being willing to talk at the key leader level, not willing to resolve any issues. But of course, the Ukraine side won't concede to any of the Russian positions here. And the Russians, of course, have not moved since last year. So again, we seem to have two immovable objects at least moved together, but they may be moving apart. How do you see it?
Well, this is exactly correct. This is exactly what Zelensky is trying to do. He's never been happy about the fact that there's been diplomatic discussions and contacts between the Americans and the Russians. He wasn't happy about the meeting between Putin and Trump in Anchorage. I mean, that was perfectly clear. And he doesn't want negotiations. He wants the Western powers to take steps that will enable him, as he believes, to win the war. And that may seem extraordinary to those of us who can quite visibly see that, on the contrary, Ukraine is losing it. But Zelensky seems to have this infinite belief that the United States especially has some kind of lever it can pull that can somehow, if it decides to pull it, will enable Ukraine to win and to achieve all its military, political, geopolitical objectives, recovery of all its territory, payments of reparations, war crimes trials, all of those kind of things. Now, what has been under discussion for some time, and this was not, by the way, provoked by this latest attack on Kyiv. It has already been underway. It has already been under discussion in Europe for several weeks now, is a 19th sanctions package that the European Union has been preparing. And Bloomberg has told us, and this is undoubtedly the case, in fact, I've no doubt this is the case, that the Europeans have come to understand that sanctions against Russia, just against Russia, have been unsuccessful. They have not been able to change Russian policy. When Kaja Kallas said in those comments you broadcast at the beginning of the program that the only thing the Russians respond to is pressure, we have applied infinite pressure on them, and we would try every conceivable measure of pressure against the Russians directly that we can, and it has failed. So, I mean, what she's saying is factually wrong and provably so.
Yeah, demonstrably so.
Demonstrably so. So what they're now talking about, and what Zelensky is hinting at, is that the Europeans, as part of their 19th sanctions package. Remember, there's been another 18. What they're now going to start to do is that they're going to start imposing sanctions, or secondary sanctions, as they call them, on Russia's trading partners, its BRICS partners, China, India, all of them. And this is where
Wait. That's part of the 19th proposed 19th round is basically secondary tariffs.
That's exactly what we're told by Bloomberg, and it's the messaging here in London is that that's exactly what they
And correct me if I'm wrong, but in the previous 18 rounds, they have just been sanctions on Russia, but not on other countries.
They've just been sanctions on Russia, but now they're going to start moving towards secondary sanctions on Russia, as they say. Now, they know perfectly well that the European Union doing that by themselves is not going to achieve anything. So what they need to do is to get the United States to go along with this, to also start sanctioning other countries. I have to say, this is, to me, irrational. Why you think that sanctions which have failed against Russia are going to succeed if you're going to start sanctioning the rest of the world, I cannot for the life of me understand. But that is the mad logic, and I do call it mad. That is the mad logic that we are now embracing.
Well, let's take a look at the first target of that the U.S. already has gone after, because you may recall Lindsey Graham a couple of months ago was waving around this big bone-crushing sanctions package that was going to go against China, India, and Brazil, among others, to do that very thing. And Trump ended up not taking any of it at that time, but then subsequently, and that actually just went into effect 2 days ago, a new 25% tariff for a total of 50% tariff on India, and claiming for the very thing that they have to stop buying oil. But here's the thing. You talk about that it can't work. Let's talk about the mechanics of this, because in order for that pressure to accomplish the political objective, which is to get India to stop buying Russian oil and therefore affect their Russian income so that they can't support the war. That's the stated objective. You would have to say, India, okay, you've been buying, and I want to say it's like 40-something% of their oil at a discounted price from Russia. You're going to have to stop doing that and find some other place to buy your oil at not reduced prices. And I don't know where 40% can just be replaced like that. So without question, you're saying to India, stop doing stuff that your whole economy right now is predicated on, this price of oil. Much more increase the oil whenever you can find it and however that can work. And that's going to cause some instability in your economics. And then it's going to raise the price of doing business. Where is it in their interest to do that?
Well, it's not. And of course, the Indians are saying that it makes absolutely no sense. I mean, what the Indians are being asked to do is to stop buying Russian oil and ultimately buy oil from the Middle East, because that's the place where the oil would have to come from. I mean, the United States exports quite a lot of oil, and some of it might conceivably be exported to India to replace Russian oil, but mostly it would be the Middle East. But if India isn't buying Russian oil, and if Europe is going to follow through on its various claims and proposals not to buy Russian oil, which is what some people in Europe wanted to do, and the only oil that is going to be internationally traded is American and Middle Eastern oil, well, then there's going to be a shortage of oil, and that's going to push up the oil price. And if you start pushing up the oil price, that's going to cause renewed inflation in the West. It's going to cause prices to rise in the United States. It's going to cause prices to rise in Europe, and we're all going to be in great difficulties. And India, of course, where people live much closer to the margins of life than they do in the developed countries which we live in, they would be pushed even further towards the margins of life. So the Indian government is saying, we are not going to do that. We cannot do this. We cannot replace very expensive oil, much more expensive oil than it is trading now, with the cheaper oil we are receiving. We have to look after our rural population, which still is by a significant margin, I understand, the majority in India, and we're going to continue to buy Russian oil because it makes sense to us. And you can impose tariffs and sanctions on us if you choose, and we don't like that at all. That's not where we want to be. But you cannot make us do something which would be so completely contrary to our interests, and by the way, yours as well.
Well, that's certainly where it's only been 2 days so far, so we'll see what happens and who blinks first. The problem is it's easy for Trump to blink. He can just take the tariffs off in a day and that problem be solved. But it's just nearly impossible and incredibly complicated for India to blink and to do what we're asking them to do. I just don't practically see how it's going to happen. So this is going to continue to be a thorn in our side and a continued promotional video for BRICS. Look, come over to us where it's a little bit more stable and you don't have to worry about somebody using the leverage against you. I mean, how do you see that aspect of it?
You're completely correct. And by the way, there's even been articles, there's an editorial in the Financial Times, which is making exactly that point, that this pressure on India is completely counterproductive because, yes, it will cause economic hurt to India. It will affect some parts of the Indian business community. Probably it will not create a crisis, though, for the Indian economy taken as a whole. It's a big economy. But denying Indians cheaper Russian oil will ultimately hurt many, many more Indians than imposing tariffs on Indian exports of gemstones,
that's a great point,
textiles, and people of that kind. That is the calculation that the Indian government has to make. So they're not going to do this. And of course, they will want to protect their industry, their gemstone industry, their textiles industry, their shrimp producing industry, all those industries. But they will find other markets for them, inevitably, over time, and they're going to look to the BRICS, and they're going to look to China, and apparently President Xi Jinping has already written to Prime Minister Modi a letter of support about this, and China does have deep pockets. It can do certain things to help India get through this, what will undoubtedly be a difficult patch. It's very strange that people like Mr. Peter Navarro, whom I think we saw there, who is clearly a clever man, cannot see this and seem so surprised and so frustrated that India is making these sort of decisions.
Yeah, we actually played some of those sound bites yesterday when John Mearsheimer was on the show, and we both just were shaking our heads. It's just difficult to see. Gary had this headline up there a second ago. I don't know if you'd seen this just before we went on the air today. Zelensky is trying to press down and kind of double down on all the emotion that's floating around, and has said, "Listen, we're going to give Russia a deadline." He's actually given a version of an ultimatum to Vladimir Putin that if he does not apparently concede to a meeting between Zelensky and Putin directly by September 1st, which is next Monday, then all of these next rounds of sanctions are going to come in. So obviously Russia would never do that, but that just shows you the mentality of where the Europeans and the Ukrainians are. They are pushing for something that they know with 100% certainty that the Russians will not do. Ergo, it's going to set the stage for more sanctions and push the sides further apart. Russia, on their side, seems to be, despite what Zelensky says, I think they do want a negotiated settlement. They would much rather accomplish their means diplomatically and end the bloodshed and end the fighting, but they are willing to go. In fact, they are declared that they will go to fight if they don't get it at the diplomacy table. But their path seems to be that they recognize this roadblock in Europe, and so they're trying to go directly to Trump and see if they can get him to shake something loose. Here is Sergei Lavrov this past Sunday talking about Russia to U.S. and U.S. to Russian views.
We respect President Trump because President Trump defends American national interests. And I have reason to believe that President Trump respects President Putin because he defends Russian national interests. We want peace in Ukraine. President Trump wants peace in Ukraine. The reaction to Anchorage meeting, the gathering in Washington of these European representatives, and what they were doing after Washington indicates that they don't want peace.
So he's like, maybe U.S. and Russia can work something out, because it's pretty clear that Europe doesn't want peace. So he said that on Sunday. And of course, now then we have this stuff happening here. And, you can't miss the fact that Russia fired these missiles into Kyiv and hit into the city with some missiles that obviously were not intercepted. It's going to make this harder. So where do you see where do you see the various sides landing here? Because it looks to me like you can make an argument that every side is saying, I'm not interested in peace at all. I just want to keep fighting.
Well, I think we need to understand the Russian position. The Russians have wanted direct talks with the Ukrainians for some time. And in May, direct talks between Russia and Ukraine began. Up to that point, I would add, the Ukrainians had refused direct talks with the Russians. It took a lot of pressure from the President of the United States, from Donald Trump, to get the Ukrainians finally to send a negotiating team to Istanbul. Now, the Russians proposed their terms, and we know what those terms are. They've set them out many, many, many times. The Ukrainians have not responded substantively so far to those terms. What they were demanding up till now was a ceasefire and a freeze of the conflict. The Russians have said, no, this isn't what we're looking for. We are wanting an actual negotiation aimed at taking us to a full peace. The Ukrainians have never put forward substantive proposals to take that process forward. They have refused suggestions from the Russians that working parties be set up to explore ideas. So I would say that when Zelensky says that the Russians need to sit down and negotiate, what he really means is that he doesn't want to negotiate with them, except get the Russians. When he talks about the Russians negotiating, he wants the Russians simply to capitulate to his terms. What the Russians, who understand this very well, and who also understand that the Europeans are supporting Zelensky in this stance, as they have been doing ever since the start of this conflict. What the Russians are trying to do is to try to get Trump again to break the diplomatic deadlock for them. He managed to get the Ukrainians to send delegations to Istanbul to meet with the Russians. Trump has also now, in effect, taken the idea of a ceasefire, at least for the moment, off the table. So that for the Russians is very, very small, very incremental progress of a kind. But obviously they would like this to go much further. And they want Trump, President Trump, to get the Ukrainians finally to start putting real counter proposals on the table, so that the Russians and the Ukrainians, and no doubt, of course, the Americans, because the Americans will always be involved, can start to work with them. Before the meeting in Washington, D.C., the one which Zelensky and the European leaders attended, I remember reading in the American media somewhere, I think it was the American media, that there were people in the Trump administration who were looking for President Zelensky to come to Washington with constructive proposals. And of course, that didn't happen. And I was wondering what the Americans would do when he didn't come with constructive proposals, which is what I was expecting. I was expecting something to happen. And to my disappointment, nothing so far has. So we'll see whether that changes.
Yeah, I think we both know the answer to that one. That nothing is coming on down the road here. I want to look at we just showed you Sergei Lavrov. There was a Ukrainian reaction to that, which again just kind of illustrates how that they are not willing in any kind of. You just talked about no constructive comments from Zelensky himself. That is echoed in their English language media, with this American commentator talking about how Lavrov is not even anything more than a mouthpiece.
If somebody understands issues well enough, which I think is always going to be a minority of citizens in the U.S. who understand well enough what the terms and conditions that we're discussing about the peace settlement are, But either way, it's not bad to have somebody on like Lavrov who so very clearly is just repeating what he's told to repeat. And Sergei Lavrov is not an important figure in Russia, as you well enough know. He's not in the inner circle of Putin. He didn't know about the full-scale invasion until, 2 or 3 hours before it began? He's not a significant figure. He's simply a mouthpiece. His only job is to read what they tell him. I don't think he thinks of anything. I've never heard at least a story even of him planning foreign policy for Russia. He's not involved in these decisions. He just repeats what the Kremlin tells him to repeat.
I let that run a little longer than it might, just because I was like, I'm going to see how much rope this dude is going to pull down for himself, because I mean, he's the dean of diplomats in the world for the last 20 something years. And to be saying that, oh yeah, he's just some mouthpiece. I mean, I guess if you want to go down that path, you can, but it's a little bit of a head scratcher.
Well, it's absolutely absurd. I mean, it's a ridiculous idea. I mean, obviously the Russians discussed together, and Lavrov, who is a very senior official in Russia, and indeed, I mean, as you absolutely rightly said, but the Russians discussed together what their proposals and their ideas are. Putin obviously is the ultimate and most important decision maker. But to suggest that Lavrov, of all people, is just a mouthpiece is absurd. It is completely ridiculous. And it comes back to your point that when you hear the Ukrainians talk in that way, it shows once again that they don't want to engage the Russians in constructive discussions. Even this idea of a meeting between Zelensky and Putin, which is what this is basically heading to. Only talk to Putin because he and he alone makes all the decisions. Nobody else in Russia matters in any way, apparently. The talk about a meeting between Zelensky and Putin is itself, for the Ukrainians, a way of avoiding substantive negotiations using the format in Istanbul, which already exists.
And do you think that because Zelensky has been trying to get a one-on-one meeting with Putin for well over a year, maybe even longer than that, and he's reiterated that here of late, do you think that the reason why that hasn't happened, or maybe a better question, do you think that, first of all, let's look at the Ukraine side of this, that Zelensky wants that meeting not to actually engage in some kind of diplomacy like Trump was doing? They were trying to find if there's any way they can come together, but either to just make himself an equal with Putin so that he's viewed that way by others, or because he want to make a grandstanding moment in front of Putin? What do you think his motivations are, Zelensky?
Well, I think there is a strong element of grandstanding about this. I think he wants to put on a show. He wants to show that the Russians take him seriously. He also probably calculates, and to some extent correctly, that if he stages a meeting with Putin and makes his demands and Putin rejects them, then of course it will put, at least in Europe and to some extent in the United States, Zelensky in a stronger position, because it will become even more obvious that Putin, well, it will create the impression that it's Putin who's being obstructive and who is refusing demands. So it's basically theater. But as I said, it also serves a purpose, which is to avoid substantive negotiations. I mean, there is a format for substantive negotiations. There have been 3 meetings between Russian and Ukrainian negotiating teams in Istanbul. Zelensky always refused to do that. He didn't want to send negotiators to meet with Russian negotiators. He doesn't want to deal with the details of the discussion. He certainly doesn't want others to be dealing with the details of the discussions. So he wants to short circuit, to close down that entire process and by replacing it with a purely performative process in which it's just a meeting between Putin and him. It's a way of avoiding negotiations rather than engaging in them.
And let's see if we can figure out why that would be, or what the ultimate objective of doing that, refusing and unwillingness to actually engage in substantive negotiations, because you got to have some sort of an objective that you want to accomplish. And even in a delusional mind, maybe you've got to have some even radical hope that something can turn in your way. And yet there are some big roadblocks. We just mentioned here about the economic issues with the sanctions. 1918 sanction package hadn't done anything. There's no reason to think any future ones go into. The secondary tariff issue right there has even more minefields, diplomatic minefields and economic minefields in the global economy. That's unlikely to even be attempted beyond the Indian one. So you've got that issue. Of course, on the battlefield itself, you have the Russian army. It's been on a nonstop offensive really since November 2023, October 2023. Sometimes fast, sometimes slow, but always going forward, et cetera. In the air, we just talked about that. Russia is continuing to step up its capacity in the air. Ukraine simply can't match it. Their air power has been increasingly used on the front line with the Russian Air Force. And then there's the issue of even the theoretical idea of bringing this to an end and having this so-called coalition of the willing that both Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron are so excited about, and they've been talking about this for a long time. As Sean Bell talked about on Sky News earlier this week, there's a logistical problem with that too.
What form will they take? Ultimately, they have to be credible and they have to have teeth. One of the challenges that Ukraine faces is they've got at least 1,000 miles of frontline border, even more if you include the border with Belarus. And let's give an idea of the scale required for troops on the ground. If you were to put troops 60 feet apart, which doesn't appear that credible as a deterrence, you'd need 100,000 troops to man the border. Now, you've got to give them a break, so they've got to have 4 months on, 4 months off, and then 4 months training ready for deployment. So you actually need 300,000 troops to be able to man that. Where would these come from? Well, the harsh reality is, even if you use the whole of the UK army, about 30,000 deployable, that's about 10%. There's potential for France to provide another 10%, but it's pretty clear Italy wouldn't provide any. Poland is worried about its own national security, and there's no way that America wants to get itself bogged down in Ukraine. And therefore, where would the rest of these troops come from? It's just not a credible option.
I want to zero in on that first thing you said there first, that the entirety of the British deployable force is only 30,000. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it is. I think that some people think that's an overestimate, and we have run down our military to an extraordinary degree in this country. I mean, I believe that you've worked with the British military. It has excellent people in it. I have no doubt that British soldiers are as good as you can imagine. But the fact is, it has been running down for years and years and years. And young people in Britain are no longer so keen to serve in the military as they once were. So, I mean, we are very, very short of men. We are very, very short of equipment. I think I told you in an earlier program, and I've had this verified, by the way, that the actual number of usable tanks that the British Army could deploy at any point in time is 40. 40.
Whoa.
40 tanks. I believe the French are in a rather better shape here than we are, but we are not in a good place. So this is a fantasy proposal. I understand that the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has been told this by military people many, many times. I understand that President Macron in France has been told the same thing. And yet, for some incomprehensible reason, this whole topic of sending this reassurance force, as it's sometimes called, or this deployment force or peacekeeping force, simply will not go away. And I think ultimately the probable reason that the Europeans are so keen to send this force to Ukraine and are coming up with this idea time and time again is because they're constantly trying to get what they call the backstop from the Americans, and they're hoping that ultimately, as part of that backstop, the Americans will do that thing which they have consistently said they do not want to do, which is to put boots on the ground, because there is no other possible logic or thinking behind this at all. So this is what this whole plan is. It's about involving the United States directly in this conflict in Ukraine. And I think people in the United States really should understand this.
Now, I think that there's virtually, I guess I can never say 100%, but a virtually no chance that even President Trump would even contemplate putting American boots on the ground. He certainly has avidly said the opposite, that he wouldn't do any boots on the ground. He said he might consider some support or air, which I also don't agree with at all. I think he shouldn't do, but no talk about boots on the ground. But even that, though, presupposes that there would be an agreement where the Russians would approve of that. And they have adamantly said throughout this whole thing that they would not do that. So the whole thing, the entire comprehensive ideas that they're pursuing are unattainable. So what is, WTH, man, help me understand what the European mentality is when they are pursuing so many things that are unattainable while the Ukraine people die on a daily basis.
It's difficult to explain or understand, because on the face of it is so completely irrational. I mean, the Europeans trying to get the Americans to do something which I suspect would be politically impossible to do in the United States. But nonetheless, the Europeans still hope some way that could happen, or at least they tell themselves that it can. Now, I think that in the end, deep down, the Europeans don't want the war to end either, at least not in the way that President Trump wants it to end, through a negotiated resolution. They don't want it to end with any kind of concessions to the Russians. I think the political leadership in Europe is so invested in Ukraine and in the whole concept of the war in Ukraine that kind of resolution frankly worries them. And it worries them also, and I've discussed this many times in many places, including, I believe, here on this channel, on this program, that the Europeans always worry that sooner or later the day will come when the Americans and the Russians will come to an understanding about European security, and the Europeans will be left out in the cold. So they don't want that to happen. Rather keep the war going, or better still, win the war in some way. They cannot win the war. They, I think, have come to understand that the United States is not going to fight the war against Russia to win the war, which is a crazy idea anyway. The Ukrainians cannot win the war. So the thing to do is to come up with these proposals all the time, talk about Putin not negotiating, not agreeing to meet Zelensky, set these deadlines, set these ultimatums. And the idea is that the Americans, with their supposedly infinite economic power, will then impose sanctions on the Russians or on Russia's trading partners. And that will finally be the thing that will force the Russians to capitulate and to sit down and talk.
Okay,
and
so
accept
let's talk about that, because you have some knowledge about the Russian economy and how things are running over there. What would be the prospect of that actually working? Let's say that they got it. Let's say that Trump he did put secondary tariffs on China, India, Brazil, maybe even some others on top of that too. What would that do to the Russian economy? Is there enough pressure? Is there some point to where economic pressure can get so great that the president of the Russian Federation would say, all right, boys, y'all come on back home. Let's stop the war and have it on some kind of terms that Europe can live with?
No, it isn't. I mean, it is an illogical idea. I mean, first of all, the thing to say about Russia is that it is an enormous country with enormous resources. I think if by now that wasn't clear, after 3.5 years of war, then people are simply not paying attention. I mean, they've got big industries. By the admission of the NATO Secretary General, they're producing many, many more weapons and arms than we are. And in order to do that, you have to have a lot of industry, which they do have, and you have to have a lot of science and technology, and you've got to have engineers, and they're self-sufficient in energy, and they're self-sufficient in food. It's not an easy country to put under that kind of economic pressure. It's not Iraq, where sanctions really did drain the life out of the economy. And of course, Russia is a big trading economy in itself. It exports to many countries of the world, and other countries depend on its exports. India, as we discussed earlier in the program, buys Russian oil. China wants to buy Russian oil. China is also interested in developing programs with the Russians. The Chinese will not sacrifice their relationship with the Russians simply because we're threatening them with tariffs. If we impose tariffs on China, they will take countermeasures, as they did in the spring.
The
They
first
will
time, yeah.
deny us rare earths and things of that kind. And yes, we can find workarounds, no doubt. Not easy thing to do, but it's not going to succeed at the core. It's never going to apply enough economic pressure on the Russians to get them to the table, given that for President Putin and a critical mass of people in Russia, I'm sure a large majority, and for the elite as well, the conflict in Ukraine is an existential matter.
And then that then leads into I asked you about the economics for the Russian side. Let's get to the military issues for the Russian side. If the Ukraine side stays where it's at, where Zelensky's been, even since Trump has been in office, and the European Union stays where it's at and what it's been talking ever since Trump came into office, they don't move. And then Trump doesn't put his weight behind it anymore, doesn't compel any changes in the European or Ukraine side. What then is that going to leave for the Russians? Meaning that there's not going to be any concessions. There's not going to be any negotiated settlement that on the terms that Russia can live with. So the only path left to Russia will be the military one. Question is, can they achieve an actual military victory over Ukraine?
Well, I think they can achieve a military victory over Ukraine because they are so much more powerful ultimately than Ukraine is. I don't think, and I've discussed this many times, I don't think ultimately that is their preferred option. They would prefer a negotiated outcome because a military victory over Ukraine is a very problematic concept. And of course, there's the question of where does the Russian army stop? How many losses does it have to incur to get there? And what, after the fighting ends, does the future hold? I mean, let's say they battle through to the Dnieper, which I think they can, and I think they probably would, within a fair approximate measure of time. And what then? What if they achieve the outcome they want and the government, the Zelensky government in Kyiv, collapses and a new government is installed which signs some kind of a peace deal with the Russians? That is the optimal outcome of the war from a Russian point of view, if we're talking about military solutions. What if many people in Ukraine won't accept it? What if many people in the West won't accept it? What if Western governments won't accept it? What if it results in long-term complications between Russia and the United States? It's not the outcome the Russians would prefer. That's why they are seeking a deal. But if they cannot get that deal, if it is permanently off the table, given that for them it is an existential issue, then they will continue the war until the kind of outcome that I set out is achieved. And I don't think anybody should be in any doubt about this. And of course, if a Russian military victory has problems for them, it has far bigger problems for us. Firstly, we will be seen to have lost. And secondly, if we're talking about the United States, and I get the sense that the United States has many interests in other places, and the president wants to focus on the United States as well. If there is a Russian military victory, then the pressure to maintain a strong, powerful American presence in Europe is going to be very, very much greater. And that is not, I think, what the president or his officials would like to see.
Man, one has to hope, but I just almost fear that just we can't think beyond the end of our nose, and that goes for the entire West. That we're just looking to get to the next week. We don't think about where this can go on the like 2 phases down the road for this, which it seems to me that the Russians are thinking 3 or 4 phases down the road. And they certainly seem to have calculated that into their capacities and their industrial capacity, their manpower creation capacity, their economic capacity. They seem to be thinking all these, way down the road where we're not thinking beyond the 19th sanctions package, apparently. So that's not really encouraging there. But I mean, I can't see any outcome that leads any different, because right now, I think I can safely categorically say the peace process that President Trump started when he came into office is dead. There's no more room for it. I think everything that could have been done has been done. The meetings have happened. The proposals have been exchanged, and we're now further away. How do you see? Do you see it any differently?
I'm afraid you've never said a true word, and you say so many. But this is absolutely right. I mean, what you said about the fact that we plan from day to day. We're in Europe. What we're trying to do all the time, we're spending an enormous amount of energy trying to keep President Trump from having discussions with President Putin and coming to agreements with him. I mean, it's quite awful, actually. We won't talk to the Russians ourselves. What we're trying to do is to stop President Trump talking to the Russians. It is an absurd situation, but you're absolutely right. We're living from day to day. And of course, when people do that, ultimately it ends badly. It always does. In any area of life, you have to some extent at least try to plan ahead. The Russians are doing that. I mean, that is partly a structural thing. I mean, that's how Russia works to a great extent. I mean, there were people who have always tended to plan, but they do plan. They plan the war. They plan their economy, the way their economy should be run. They plan how to build up their foreign relations. They're meeting in Tianjin in China. Tomorrow, their president is meeting the president of China and the prime minister of India, two of the most powerful people in the world. So you can see that they are planning. We are not. And in any conflict type situation that I know of, I'm sure this is true. Of course, it's true in war. I've no doubt it's true in war, but it's also true in litigation. It's true in business, in anything. Those who plan tend to win. Those who don't and make it up as they're going along tend to lose. But that's exactly where we are, as you so rightly said.
So kind of as a wrap up here, I think that we can say, at least on the surface, that what the entire West writ large is doing is just detached from reality. It's unrealistic. It certainly is not going to accomplish anything good. Probably is going to lose in every realm you want to have. The one possibility that there is some thought that is longer term gets into a little bit darker of a territory, and I'd like your view on the viability of this. One of the other possibilities or interpretations is that the European leaders are well aware of all these things we mentioned. They know that they're going to lose this conflict. It's already lost, and they're actually playing for what comes next, which is creation of some sort of new Cold War, where Russia can be seen as this, modern day Hitler, where, oh my God, they just took Ukraine. We're next if we don't up our really big, really fast. And so that gives more impetus to higher defense budgets, faster ramping up from what's even currently envisioned here, because they want to have this situation where there's basically a new Cold War. Is
Absolutely.
that plausible?
I think it's entirely plausible, and I don't think it is that far under the surface. I'm sure that there are people in Europe who'd say this and who are discussing this. And of course, the point is, again, keeping the Americans in Europe. This is always the ultimate obsession, because to discuss this, and Professor Mearsheimer and I have talked about this with each other many times. You can see the programs we do with Glenn Deason. The Europeans need, or believe they need, the Americans to stay, not just because the Americans keep the Russians at bay, but because the Americans have been so instrumental in Europe over the last 80 years in preserving peace. We have had a long history of conflicts with each other. Those conflicts, people worry, would resume if the Americans, the American pacifiers, were to leave. So you keep the Americans in Europe by creating this specter of the Russians and telling the Americans, if you don't stay in Europe, the Russians will take it over, and that will be a disaster for you. There's that famous quip by Lord Ismay, who was the first Secretary General of NATO, a British official, and he said that the entire purpose of NATO is threefold. It's to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans
in.
in.
Yeah. Right. And you know, that whole thing rests on a profoundly illogical fact, or maybe a powerful omission, is because the idea, because without the American backstop, the Russians could come rolling in, or maybe we could splinter, etc. This ain't 1938 anymore. In 1938, Hitler had a force that could do a lot of this stuff, but there was no nuclear weapons on the Western side that could provide a roadblock for them. Right now, you can't go rolling in with a NATO army into Russia. You can't go in with the Russian army rolling into NATO, because both sides have nuclear weapons that will deter the other. No one's going to do that. So this is not 1938, and the Russians aren't going to roll an army across, because you have Britain and France, your own nuclear weapons, which Russia is well aware of, and they don't want to commit suicide and draw nuclear weapons on themselves. So they're not going to do this. And that simple foundational reality is like ignored, or I don't know. It baffles me, I got to say.
You're completely correct. I mean, it's an absurd idea. I mean, it's not 1938, and it's not even 1946, when Stalin had vast armies on the Oder, which he could, at least in theory, move westward. Not that, though it seems that he never did, in fact, plan to do that. But I mean, at least in 1946, you could tell yourself that that was a real danger. So you needed the Americans there, because the British and the French in those days did not have nuclear weapons. Now they do. Now, the Russia of today is not the Soviet Union of 1946. Right. I mean, it is an absurd idea. It's nonsensical, in fact. But of course, it is the scarecrow that is always raised up, and it's done partly in order to frighten the people of Europe themselves, partly so that they can increase defense spending and do all of those things, and continue to support this increasingly unpopular project of European integration, which is a huge topic which we can discuss on a different program. But also, and first and foremost, keep the Americans in. Keep the Americans in Europe, because without them, we are in a world that we cannot imagine and are very afraid of, and just don't know where it will go.
Yeah, I'd like you to find out. I want you to try to find and work out with that world and make it happen. Let's be friends, but you don't need us in there. I mean,
no, it would be a better place. We would then start taking responsibility for our own decisions. It would be a better place in Europe. Britain, France, Germany would be viable and independent countries. We would not have ridiculous situations like all those European leaders going to the Oval Office and cowering in front of the President of the United States, which is shameful. And it would be a better place for the United States too, which doesn't want, I think this is true, doesn't ultimately want to be in this situation where it is taking responsibility for Europe all the time and is tied down to it constantly in the way that it is. So I think that all of these fears, including the fears that the Europeans undoubtedly do have of each other, are groundless. It's something we should embrace, not run away from. Indeed. But I'm afraid there are very, very few people in power in Europe who think in that way.
Very few. There's a couple, but they don't have much influence. But anyway, but all we can do is to illuminate the truth and the reality, and show that there is a path. There is a path to end the war. There is a path to bring stability to the European continent and economic vitality for everybody. That's on the table, and it's possible if only our leaders would accept it. But there it is. We have it. But listen, appreciate you coming on. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Invite everybody to go to Alexander Mercouris on his Duran show. And also when you're on with your other buddy, Alex, there on those shows. Yeah, so that's a lot of good stuff there. Anything coming up new? Anything on the show that you want to highlight?
Oh no, I mean at the moment, I mean we churn out programs all the time, but I think one thing that is coming, obviously, we're going to look at this whole BRICS meeting, rather Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting that's happening in China, and we'll be discussing the issues between India and the United States in a lot more detail. And of course, there's also a lot of concerns about the situation in the Middle East, about Iran. There's been a decision to reimpose sanctions on Iran, snapback sanctions. That's obviously an important topic, and we'll be talking about that as well. But we're there every day. We're churning out things every day. Go to us, and we will undoubtedly educate you, as I get educated when I come on this program.
and vice versa, I assure you. Thank you very much, and we will look forward to seeing you guys on the next episode of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.